The federal agents walked into the boardroom while I was still speaking. For a moment, I thought they were lost. Then one of them held up a badge. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need you to come with us." The room went silent. 12 executives stared at me. The projector still showed the quarterly growth chart behind my head. Before I could stand, a chair scraped the floor. My husband, Evan, rose slowly from the other side of the table. He folded his arms and gave a cold smile. "Well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess the truth finally caught up with you." My stomach tightened. The agents placed documents on the table. "Financial fraud investigation," one of them said. Gasps spread around the room. Then Evan delivered the final blow. "I'll be filing for divorce today," he announced calmly. People stared at him in shock. But I wasn't shocked. I was watching his eyes. And in that moment, I knew something terrifying. He had expected this. My name is Natalie Whitmore. I had built Whitmore Logistics from nothing. 15 years earlier, I ran shipments from a tiny warehouse with 2 employees and an old laptop that overheated every hour. Now we handled supply chains across 12 states. 400 employees. Major corporate clients. Everything in that company carried my fingerprints. Every contract. Every expansion. Every risk. Evan joined the business 8 years after I started it. At the time, he said he wanted to help. "Marriage means building together," he told me. I believed him. I made him chief operating officer. The board supported the decision because the company was growing fast and they trusted my judgment. But sitting in that boardroom while federal agents waited beside me, I saw a side of Evan I had never seen before. He looked calm.
Too calm.
Not worried about the company.
Not worried about me.
Just watching. Like someone who had been waiting for the moment the trap finally closed. The agents explained the charges in careful, formal voices. Millions of dollars had disappeared from vendor accounts. Payments had been redirected through shell companies. Contracts had been approved using my authorization. They placed printed records in front of me. Bank transfers. Approval logs. Signed documents. My signature appeared everywhere.
Perfect. Clean.
Convincing. But I knew instantly something was wrong. I never signed those approvals. Across the table, Evan leaned back in his chair. "You should cooperate," he said calmly. One of the board members looked at me with concern. "Natalie, is there an explanation?" I didn't answer, because I was still staring at the signatures. They looked real, but something about them felt mechanical. Then Evan spoke again. "We need stability for the company," he told the board. "Natalie should step down until the investigation ends." It sounded reasonable, professional, but I felt a cold realization forming in my chest. Evan wasn't reacting. He was steering the moment. By evening, the story was everywhere. News vans parked outside our headquarters. Reporters stood behind barricades, shouting questions whenever someone walked through the doors. Inside, I watched the news from my lawyer's office. CEO of major logistics company under federal investigation. My face filled the television screen. My lawyer muted the sound. "The charges aren't filed yet," she said carefully. "It's still an investigation." I nodded slowly. Then my phone buzzed. A message from a board member. "Emergency meeting completed. Temporary leadership vote passed. Interim CEO appointed." I opened the attachment. The document listed the result clearly. Chief Operating Officer to assume leadership during investigation. Evan Whitmore. My husband had taken control of the company. In less than 12 hours. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I whispered the question that refused to leave my mind.
How had he moved this fast?
The divorce papers arrived the next morning. A courier knocked on my apartment door and handed me a thick envelope. No message. No explanation. Just legal documents. I sat at the kitchen table and read them slowly. Irreconcilable differences. Financial misconduct. Demand for asset division. Evan had filed the paperwork the same day the investigation began. Not even 24 hours later. The speed of it made my chest tighten. This wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal in the heat of the moment. It was planning. Careful planning. Then I reached the section about company assets. Evan's lawyer demanded half the business during divorce settlement. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I leaned back and laughed softly. Because there was one detail Evan had clearly forgotten. Or maybe he never knew. Whitmore Logistics wasn't marital property. Legally, it had never belonged to him. Years earlier, when Whitmore Logistics was still small, I had structured the company through a holding trust.
My lawyer insisted at the time.
Protect your work, he told me. Success changes people. The trust owned most of the company, 82%. I was the sole beneficiary. The structure kept the company separate from personal assets, including marriage. Back then, it felt unnecessary. I trusted Evan completely. When he joined the business years later, he focused on operations, not ownership. He never asked questions about the legal structure, and I never thought it mattered. But sitting in my quiet apartment, holding divorce papers in my hands, I realized something important. Evan believed the investigation would destroy me. If I lost the company, he could claim control during the divorce. He had already positioned himself as interim CEO. Everything lined up perfectly. Too perfectly. Which meant the investigation might not have been random. Someone might have helped create it. I started reviewing every financial document tied to the investigation. For 2 days, I barely slept. Spreadsheets covered my dining table. Bank transfers. Vendor invoices. Internal approval logs. The pattern slowly appeared. Every questionable payment came from the operations division. Evan's department. At first, I assumed someone inside his team had manipulated the system. But the more I studied the records, the stranger it looked. The authorizations carried my digital signature, yet they passed through the COO approval channel first. That step required Evan's department to process the request, which meant 2 possibilities existed. Either someone in operations had framed me, or someone higher up approved everything. My pulse slowed as the thought formed. I opened the access logs again. Each suspicious transaction had been processed using credentials connected to Evan's office. I leaned back in my chair. I still didn't have proof. But for the first time, I had a direction. I hired a forensic accountant the next morning. Quietly. I didn't inform the board. I didn't tell my lawyer. I simply contacted a specialist recommended years earlier by an investor. His name was Daniel Cross. We met in a small office downtown. I slid a flash drive across the table. Company records, I said. I need you to track every suspicious transfer. He studied the files for several days. When he finally called me, his voice sounded serious. You need to come in, he said. When I arrived, charts covered the walls. Money trails. Account numbers. Corporate filings. Daniel pointed at a group of shell companies. These received the stolen payments, he explained. I leaned closer. Who owns them? He hesitated. Then he turned the screen toward me. Corporate documents filled the display. One name appeared repeatedly. Evan Whitmore. While Daniel continued tracing the money, the company moved forward without me. I watched everything from a distance. One night, I saw a photo posted online by one of the senior managers. It showed a leadership dinner at a downtown restaurant. Champagne glasses raised. Executives smiling. Evan sat at the head of the table. My chair. The caption read, New Era for Whitmore Logistics. The photo burned in my chest for several seconds. Then the anger faded. Because anger was exactly what Evan expected. Instead, I zoomed in on the picture. Every person at that table worked directly under operations. Evan's circle. His loyal group. The same division connected to the suspicious transactions. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. The trap was becoming clearer. Evan believed he had already won. But he didn't realize something important. He was celebrating too early. 2 weeks after the investigation began, the board scheduled another meeting. Official agenda. Leadership review. Evan expected my resignation. Instead, I walked into the room. Conversations stopped instantly. Several board members looked stunned. Evan's jaw tightened. You shouldn't be here, he said. I pulled out a chair and sat down calmly. I'm still a board member, I replied. The chairman cleared his throat. We thought you might step aside during the investigation. I already have, I said. From daily operations. Then I slid a document across the table. Trust ownership certification. The chairman read the first page slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Evan frowned. What is this? The chairman looked up. It confirms majority ownership, he said quietly. 82%. The room fell silent. I folded my hands on the table. Which means, I added calmly, I still control this company. For the first time since the investigation began, Evan looked unsettled. You're still under investigation, he said sharply. Yes, I replied. And until it finishes, leadership remains temporary. One board member nodded. That's reasonable. Evan forced a tight smile. We're only protecting the company. I met his eyes. I agree. Then I stood slowly. Just remember something, I said. This company cannot be sold, divided, or transferred without my approval. A long pause followed. Evan's face turned pale for a second before he recovered. The board chairman closed the folder. Natalie will remain majority owner until the investigation concludes. The meeting ended soon after. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt Evan stare on my back. For the first time, he looked worried. And that meant one thing. He was beginning to realize his plan wasn't perfect. Daniel called again 3 days later. I found something else, he said. When I arrived at his office, he pointed to another file. One of the shell companies receiving the stolen funds had a second director listed. Not Evan. A woman. Name, Lydia Harper. I searched the company records. Recognition hit immediately. Lydia had worked as a consultant in our operations department the previous year. Evan hired her personally. Daniel continued explaining the pattern. Money moved through multiple shell accounts before reaching a private investment fund. That fund listed Lydia as managing partner. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Evan hadn't just stolen money. He had built a system to hide it. And Lydia wasn't just a consultant. She was part of the plan. Maybe even more. I asked Daniel to dig deeper into Lydia Harper. The results came quickly. She had no real consulting background before joining our company. But her financial history showed sudden growth after she met Evan. New property purchases. Large investment accounts. Travel records matching Evan's business trips. I sat quietly while Daniel finished the report. You think they're involved personally? He asked carefully. I closed the folder. I think they've been planning this for a long time. The pieces finally aligned. The investigation. The forged approvals. The sudden divorce filing. The shell companies. Evan had created a perfect story. If I went to prison for fraud, he would control the company. And the stolen money would stay hidden. I looked at Daniel. Prepare everything, I said calmly. Every document. Every transfer. He frowned. For what? I met his eyes. For the moment the truth finally turns. 2 days later, I walked into the federal building with a thick folder in my hands. The same agents who had come to the boardroom met me again. This time we sat across a quiet table in a gray office. I brought information, I said. They looked surprised but listened carefully as I laid out the documents. Daniel had prepared everything in order. Bank transfers, shell companies, and the link to Lydia Harper. The lead agent studied the papers for a long time. You're saying your husband arranged this? He asked. I'm saying the money trail leads to him, I replied. He leaned back in his chair. If this is accurate, Mrs. Whitmore, then the investigation changes direction. That's why I came, I said quietly. They kept the files and promised to review them with their financial unit. When I stepped outside the building, the cold air felt sharp against my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small shift. The truth was finally moving. But Evan still believed he was winning. The official audit began 3 days later. Investigators arrived at company headquarters with boxes, laptops, and serious expressions. Employees whispered in the hallways as they passed. Evan tried to act confident. He walked through the building with the same controlled smile he always used during stressful deals. But I noticed the difference. The investigators spent most of their time inside the operations department. Evan's territory. They requested email records, authorization logs, and vendor contracts. Every time new documents appeared, the pattern looked worse. More transfers. More shell accounts. More approvals passing through the COO channel. One board member called me privately. "This is getting serious," he said. "I know," I replied. "Did you know anything about this before?" I paused before answering. I suspected something was wrong.
The board member sighed.
Well, the investigators definitely think so. And somewhere inside the building, Evan was starting to feel the pressure. The first time Evan called me after the investigation began, I almost didn't answer. His name flashed across the screen while I was reviewing documents with Daniel. Curiosity won. I stepped outside and picked up.
"Natalie," he said.
His voice sounded tight. "We need to talk."
"About what?"
I asked calmly. "The company. The investigation. This situation." I leaned against the railing. "We already are talking. The investigators are handling it." He hesitated. "You gave them something." It wasn't a question. I let the silence stretch. "You're making a mistake," he continued.
"Am I?"
I asked. His voice sharpened. "If the company collapses, you lose everything too." I almost laughed. "That depends," I said softly. "On what?" "On who actually caused the collapse." He didn't answer. The line went quiet for several seconds. Then he hung up. And I knew one thing for certain. Evan was afraid. The board called another meeting 2 weeks later. This time the investigators attended. I joined by video from my lawyer's office. Evan sat at the conference table with the board members. He looked tired. The lead investigator opened a folder. "We have traced several unauthorized transfers from company accounts," he explained. He displayed charts on the screen. Each transfer followed the same path. Company account. Vendor approval. Shell company. Private fund. Every arrow pointed through the COO approval system. The board members shifted uneasily. The chairman looked at Evan. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Evan's jaw tightened. "These records are incomplete," he said. "We are still reviewing them." The investigator nodded slowly. "That's correct." He closed the folder. "But the current evidence suggests the activity originated within the operations department." A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone knew who ran that department. The twist came the next morning. I was drinking coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Federal agents had returned to Whitmore Logistics. But this time they weren't looking for me. They walked straight to Evan's office. Employees later told the story again and again. Agents stepped inside.
The door closed.
10 minutes later it opened again. Evan came out with 2 agents beside him. His hands were behind his back, handcuffed. The entire floor went silent as they led him toward the elevators. Someone filmed it on their phone. The video spread through the company within minutes. I watched it once. Evan's face looked pale and stunned. For the first time since the investigation began, he looked exactly how I had felt in that boardroom weeks earlier.
Trapped.
But this time, the trap wasn't mine. The full investigation moved quickly after Evan's arrest. More financial records surfaced. More accounts connected to Lydia Harper. The investigators explained the scheme clearly during the next briefing. Evan had been redirecting vendor payments for nearly a year. The money passed through shell companies and ended inside a private investment fund. When early questions appeared during an internal audit, Evan created false approvals under my name. If the fraud was discovered, I would take the blame. The forged documents made it look like I authorized everything. Then he filed for divorce the moment the investigation began. If I were convicted, he would remain CEO and keep control of the company. The plan almost worked. Almost. But the digital trails inside the operations system told the real story. And every trail pointed back to him. The board removed Evan the same afternoon. Termination for cause. The announcement went out to employees and clients within hours. Later that evening the chairman called me. "Natalie," he said, "the company needs leadership again." I understood what he meant. "You want me to return?" "Yes." I looked out the window of my apartment at the city lights. For weeks I had watched the company from a distance while everything collapsed. Now the board was asking me to come back.
"Give me a few days," I said.
"We'll support whatever you decide," the chairman replied. After the call ended, I sat quietly. Whitmore Logistics had been my life's work. Walking away would be easy now. But rebuilding it would mean facing everything that happened. The betrayal, the scandal, the questions. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I realized something simple. The company deserved better than what Evan tried to turn it into. 3 weeks later, the government made a public statement. The investigation into me was officially closed. All charges dropped. The press conference aired on every news channel. Evidence shows Mrs. Whitmore was not involved in the fraudulent activity, the spokesperson said. Instead, they confirmed the case against Evan and his financial partner. Lydia Harper had been arrested 2 days earlier. The headlines changed quickly. CEO cleared in fraud investigation. COO husband charged with corporate theft. Friends and colleagues began sending messages again. People who had stayed quiet suddenly remembered how long they had known me. I didn't respond to most of them. Reputation returns slowly, but truth returns faster than lies. And this time, the truth had documents behind it. The divorce finished quietly a month later. Evan's lawyers tried to negotiate for part of the company, but the trust documents ended the argument quickly. Whitmore Logistics had never been marital property. The judge reviewed the paperwork and closed the issue within minutes. Evan kept his personal accounts. Everything connected to the fraud remained frozen by the court. I didn't attend the final hearing. My lawyer handled it. By then, the emotional part of the story was already over. There was nothing left to say. Evan had built his entire plan on the belief that the company belonged to both of us. But ownership doesn't come from marriage. It comes from building something piece by piece. And Whitmore Logistics had always been my work, not his. The morning I returned to headquarters felt strangely quiet. Employees watched as I walked through the front doors. Some smiled. Some simply nodded. When I stepped onto the main operations floor, something unexpected happened. People stood. No announcement. No signal. They simply stood from their desks as I passed. Not out of fear. Out of respect. The chairman met me outside the boardroom. "Welcome back," he said. Inside the room, the same long table waited. The same projector. The same chairs. But the atmosphere felt different.
Cleaner. Honest.
I took my seat and opened the meeting. "We have work to do," I told them. No one argued. The company had survived the worst moment in its history. Now it was time to rebuild. In the months that followed, Whitmore Logistics slowly regained its reputation. New clients returned. Old contracts were renewed. The board strengthened financial controls across every department. Trust had been damaged, but not destroyed. Sometimes people asked how I stayed calm through everything. The truth was simple. Anger makes people reckless. Patience makes them dangerous. If I had exploded the day Evan filed for divorce, I might have lost everything. Instead, I waited. The documents spoke louder than any argument. The investigation revealed what emotions never could. Evan believed confidence would protect him. But arrogance leaves fingerprints everywhere. And eventually someone notices. In this case, that someone was me. People still ask if I regret marrying Evan. The answer surprises them. I don't. Because that marriage taught me something important. Success attracts loyalty, but it also attracts ambition. The difference between the two becomes clear when power appears. The day federal agents entered that boardroom, Evan thought my life was ending. He believed the investigation would destroy me. He believed the divorce would give him control. He believed the company was already his. But he forgot one simple truth. Ownership isn't about titles or marriage. It's about who built the foundation. And when everything collapsed around him, the truth stood exactly where it always had. Whitmore Logistics still belonged to the person who created it.
Me.